What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi. We've got a festive Christmas hat on because it's time for day 2 of the Grotsmas calendar. Games Workshop is releasing a new detachment for over 40k every day of December up until Christmas, and I'm going to talk about all of them as long as you keep watching. So please like and subscribe. Just a crumb of viewership, sir, please. Now, we started strong with the Fly-Blown Host from Death Guard, which added basically a whole new play style to the faction. Now let's move on to Dark Angels and talk about the Lion's Blade Task Force. And this one, probably not quite as transformative as the first one. Although, when you're talking about Dark Angels, one of the armies with the most access to do different detachments out of any faction in 40k, it's a lot different than talking about Death Guard, which only have a single detachment to begin with. So let's dive in, talk about what is in this detachment, some ways we can play it, and let's build a list using the detachment. So Lion's Blade Task Force is trying to accomplish essentially a combined arms style of a Dark Angels list that is using both Raven Wing and Deathwing components together and using them to support each other, which is kind of a laudable goal. Unfortunately for us, the way that they do it is a little convoluted, and I think this is going to make this one of the most complex and, I guess, idiosyncratic detachments in the game. The detachment ability in the Lion's Claws gives you a different effect depending on whether you're a Raven Wing or a Deathwing unit. Raven Wing units force enemies, excluding monsters and vehicles, to take desperate escape checks when falling back from them, and impose an additional -1 penalty on them if the unit is battle shocked. This is cool, but not that great. Kind of whatever, a little quality of life, but it is what it is. The big benefit here, however, is the second part of this ability. Each time a Deathwing unit from your army declares a charge, if one or more of the targets of that charge are within engagement range of one or more Raven Wing units from your army, you get +2 to the charge roll. This is going to be huge for Deathwing units that are arriving from reserve, for example, setting up 9 inches away from enemies and then getting that +2 charge bonus to ensure that they can make those relatively easy charges. Especially once you start combining these with charge rerolls, a 7-inch charge from a 9-inch charge with a reroll gets to a pretty high likelihood, somewhere around 75 to 80%. Obviously, you don't always want to be putting your entire game plan on just that charge roll, but still pretty nice to have. Now, what about the enhancements? The first one we have is Calibonite Armaments. This is an easy one. You can apply it to any Adeptus Astartes model. It adds +1 to your melee damage. Done. Seems good. Obviously, there's a lot of places for this. I think most interestingly, things like Foot Captains, because they have Finest Hour, they can expand the number of attacks and have devastating wounds. Getting additional damage on those guys is sweet. Also, if you have a weapon with extra attacks, this will affect both of those weapons. So something like a Gravis Captain, for example, that has a bunch of attacks, adding +1 damage to those is going to be good as well. Generally speaking, +1 damage is just great. So this is a solid enhancement if you have a slot for it. Lord of the Hunt can only be attached to a Raven Wing model. The bearer's unit is eligible to shoot and declare a charge in a turn in which it fell back. Pretty nice. And you reroll desperate escape checks taken for models in the bearer's unit. This is really interesting. It can let you do a lot of funky stuff with falling back. You can, for example, move a unit in, engage enemies, hopefully survive for a turn, and then fall back through them and reroll your desperate escape checks. It's also very difficult to pin this unit in that case, or even if your opponent has other effects that affect desperate escape, you will still be able to fall back just fine. Also, interestingly, it still turns on while you're battle shocked. So if you're taking desperate escape because you're battle shocked, you still get to reroll those as well. You don't necessarily just have to be moving through enemies to do it. Unfortunately, where this can be applied is extremely narrow. It's basically just like Raven Wing command squads and bike chaplains, and I don't know how often you're going to be taking those units in this detachment specifically. While it is a nice quality of life for the units that can take it, it's tough to fit them into an army. Stalwart Champion is the big expensive one for the detachment. It gives you +1 OC while you're not battle shocked and can be attached to a captain, chaplain, or lieutenant only. That not battle shocked clause is important because typically you are reduced to OC 0 when you're battle shocked, but that's a characteristic replacement effect, which means modifiers like +1 OC would come into play afterwards. So if in another situation, if you have like an ancient attached to your unit, for example, and that unit's battle shocked, they return to OC 0, then get +1 OC, so they become OC 1 instead. Because Stalwart Champion specifically only works while you're not battle shocked, it doesn't do that. I don't know why this is the 25.1, to be perfectly honest. I don't know how often you're really that excited about +1 OC on a Space Marine unit, like typically you're either killing enemies on the objective and controlling the objective, or you're dead. There are not that many instances where you are like fighting tooth and nail for that one extra pip of OC in a Space Marine army in order to take an objective from somebody, because that's not really typically how Space Marines play. They play small, low OC units that just kill their opponent. But in the situations where you can take it, it's nice to have. I think they're maybe trying to push like a big Terminator brick with this, but I don't know if the other abilities in the detachment are really that conducive to that kind of play style. Fulgus Magna might be my favorite one out of the detachment, however. It can only be applied to a Deathwing model. Once per battle at the end of your opponent's turn, if the bearer's unit is not within engagement range of one or more enemy units, you can use the enhancement, you pick them up off the battlefield and place them into strategic reserve. It's just a veil of darkness. Because Deathwing units are almost entirely composed of Terminators, you get Deep Strike, and when you arrive from strategic reserve, you can use Deep Strike, so you can just use it to uppy downy your Terminator units. Super cool. The downside is that you have to bring a Terminator character, and those tend to be very expensive, especially attaching a Terminator character to something like Deathwing Knights, which is already an expensive unit, gets kind of prohibitive. So it's another instance of like a good enhancement, but the places that you can put it are very limited. If you could attach this to epic heroes, I think it would be amazing. If you could do things like pick up Azrael and a bunch of dudes off the table and drop them back in, I think that'd be awesome. But obviously that's not how epic heroes work, so it's a lot tougher to fit them in. Part of the problem might be that Dark Angels just have really good epic heroes, which can't take enhancements. So these enhancements don't feel quite as impactful as they would in a different faction. Now, before we move on and talk about stratagems, we have talked a lot about Deathwing and Ravenwing. I think it's important to note what units actually fall into these categories, because that's going to be really important as we discuss what units can benefit from these stratagems. Ravenwing units are the black armored vanguard of the Dark Angels chapter. The keyword is applied to all mounted units and vehicles with fly when you're building a Dark Angels army. So this will affect all your bikers, all your invader ATVs, and importantly, vehicles with flies, so things like Storm Raven gunships, all your aircraft, as well as Storm Speeders. Deathwing, on the other hand, is a little bit more inclusive. This affects Terminator units, Blade Guard Ancient, Blade Guard Veterans, Stern Guard Veterans, and Vanguard Veterans, as well as a bunch of different vehicles, including every single Dreadnought in the faction, all the Land Raiders, alongside the big Repulsor tanks, Repulsors and Repulsor Executioners. Now, for the most part, almost everything in this detachment is going to be composed of one of these two keywords, because the detachment has very little support for any green wing units, the regular Dark Angels that wear green armor that aren't part of the Ravenwing or the Deathwing. So with that in mind, let's dive into the stratagems. The first one is overpowering exaction. Now, we just talked about the Flyblown host in the last video. They just like have the same stratagem. I guess this is maybe a trope, like a cycle that the design team wants to include.
It's weird that it happened twice, right?
This is used in the command phase or the start of the fight phase. You force an enemy unit within engagement range of one of your units to take a battle shock check. They get -1 if your unit is either Deathwing or Ravenwing, which, to be fair, it probably is, because that's the detachment we're playing. There is a restriction. You can only use it once per battle round, so you can't, for example, use it at the start of the fight phase and then the subsequent command phase, unless you are the first player, or you're using it at the fight phase of the second player, then progressing over to the first player's command phase. So actually, going first, there's like a little bit of a bonus on this for this stratagem, because you have 2 chances to battle shock someone before it goes to your scoring step. If you're first, you can do it at the end of the opponent's turn and then at the start of your turn. So that's kind of cute. You can't do that if you're going second, though, so it gets stuffed. Because Ravenwing have that synergy with battle shocked units where they're forcing additional penalties on them for desperate breakout checks, this has some additional use case over top what it would normally be, but otherwise, stratagems like these are just nice to have. You have an opportunity to try to break your opponent's objective control, to steal objectives from them, or complete secondaries. So it's not something you're going to use every game, but it's definitely something to keep in the chamber if you really need it in a tight game. Armor of Contempt is also included. It's an easy one. Every Space Marine detachment has that one. We've seen it a million times. Interestingly, it does have a second defensive stratagem, however, in Strength in Unity. This is a wild stratagem. It's very complex, so let's break it down. It is used specifically in the fight phase after you're selected as the target of an attack. You can use it on a single Astartes unit from your army that was selected as the target, normal defensive stratagem stuff. However, the effect of the stratagem is different based on who is engaging the enemy. If the enemy unit that is attacking you is engaged by a Ravenwing unit, they get -1 to hit. And or if the unit is in engagement range of a Deathwing unit, they get a bodyguard effect, so -1 to wound if their strength is higher than your toughness. That's good because, as we talked about before, things like Dreadnoughts and Repulsors are Deathwing, so you don't want to give them a flat -1 to wound because they would be impossible to kill in melee. So let's talk about how this would work on the table, for example. You are, let's say, a random unit. Let's say an infiltrator squad. Your infiltrator squad is being attacked by an enemy melee attacker. However, you also have an outrider engaging that enemy unit. Even though that enemy unit is attacking your infiltrators, not the outrider, because the outrider's engaging them, and it has the Ravenwing keyword, they get -1 to hit the target of the stratagem, which is the infiltrator squad. Similarly, if you also have a Deathwing Knight engaging that enemy squad, they would also get -1 to wound, assuming their strength is high enough. These two things stack, and they also work if the target of the stratagem has one of those keywords. So let's say, for example, you're just a Deathwing Knight, and your opponent's engaging you and fighting you in melee. You are, by definition, engaging them with a Deathwing unit, so they're going to get -1 to wound if their strength characteristic is high enough, as we just talked about. Same goes for Ravenwing as well. So at the baseline, this is a fight phase defensive stratagem for Ravenwing and Deathwing unit. But in some situations, if you're able to, like the detachment's trying to do, combine your attacks and engage with both Deathwing and Ravenwing at the same time, you're going to get huge defensive bonuses from this. Now, there is a little bit of a restriction here. You can't be targeted by Strength and Unity and Armor of Contempt in the same phase. Thank God. I kind of hope that they add riders like this to defensive stratagems moving on into the future. Who knows? We're looking down the barrel of a data slate coming this month or next month, maybe. We could see that technology get reproduced. That would be pretty cool, to be honest. One thing that absolutely gets my goat is when something like a Land Raider windmill slams 2 defensive strats, one after another, like Smokescreen and Armor of Contempt, getting -1 to hit and +2 to their saves. This is already a tough addition to get kills in, and as soon as your opponent is able to dump a bunch of defensive stratagems all on one unit, it gets absolutely disgusting. And so I really like that they have included this rider here. The other thing to keep in mind is that this isn't keyworded to a specific type of Deathwing or Ravenwing unit. So you can use it, for example, on Stormraven gunship that's in melee. Will get -1 to be hit because it's a Ravenwing unit. And they're also base -1 damage, so you're stacking additional characteristic modifiers on top of each other. Things like Redemptor Dreadnoughts and Land Raiders, like I just talked about, are also Deathwing units. It doesn't care if you're infantry or vehicle or whatever, so let's see something big, a big bloodthirster is coming at you, you can give them -1 to wound. It is fight phase only, and it is exclusive with Armor of Contempt, so there's not a million situations in which you want to use this. But if you are getting hit by that big, kind of like low volume, high impact attack with a huge high strength, this might be able to foil your opponent, especially if their AP is like through the roof and you don't care about Armor of Contempt that much anyway. Knights of Iron is the next one. This is really cool. I love that there's a callback here to Chaos Knights in the stratagem. It's used in your movement or your charge phase. It targets a Ravenwing unit from your army. Until the end of the phase, the models in that unit can make normal, advance, or charge moves horizontally through terrain features. This is enormous. It lets Ravenwing units go through walls, which is the biggest downside of the mounted keyword. It, like the last stratagem we talked about, is not keyed to a specific type of Ravenwing unit, so you could use it on things like Storm Speeders and Stormraven gunships and all that stuff that could be hiding behind a wall, but have a tough time getting around it. 1 CP, just go straight through, pretty cool. You can also use it on both movement and charge if you want to, so you could have a really fast Ravenwing unit, for example, move through a wall, then charge through another wall that your opponent's hiding behind, as long as you have space to clear it. Importantly, this doesn't let you sit inside a wall. Games Workshop's made it very clear that that is not the intended play pattern of Warhammer 40,000. You're not supposed to be able to wall phase and end charge moves halfway through a terrain feature. So as long as you can clear through the wall, you could potentially get behind it and around enemy units that thought they were safe. Very cool. Again, like I said, this is basically a duplication of Knights of Shade from Chaos Knights. We called it Knights of Iron this time. I love that. I think it all by itself basically makes larger bike bricks for Ravenwing much more playable, and especially given all of the buffs that they give the rest of the army, some of which we'll talk about right now, you're definitely looking to include some of that in this list. So speaking of that, let's talk about the next stratagem. This might be the biggest one in the detachment. This is Illuminating Fire. You use it in your shooting phase just after a Ravenwing unit from your army has selected its targets. You target the Ravenwing unit and you choose one enemy unit within 12 inches that you are attacking with that Ravenwing unit. Until the end of the phase, Deathwing units in your army get +1 to wound that enemy unit. So, you go with a Ravenwing unit, you shoot at an enemy, use the stratagem before you roll any attacks. It happens automatically. It doesn't require you to score a hit or anything like that. You just use it and get the buff as long as you're targeting an enemy within 12. Given how fast Ravenwing units are, and especially alongside the combination of Knights of Iron, so you can get them closer, it's going to be fairly easy. Then every single Deathwing unit in your army gets +1 to wound that enemy. It doesn't have to pick a specific Deathwing unit to benefit. It affects all of them. And let's reiterate real quick, Deathwing units include things like Dreadnoughts and Land Raiders. So that's insane. The big one here, in my opinion, are things like Ballistus Dreadnoughts, which are very self-sufficient, but of middling strength. As soon as you improve their reliability, especially on that wound roll, since they're likely getting hit rolls as well because of their own abilities, they go absolutely through the roof. In my opinion, this stratagem is basically one that most Lion's Blade task forces are going to be built around. Now, last and certainly not least here, we have Inescapable Wrath. This is a super weird one, so let's talk about how it works. It's a 2 CP stratagem, so relatively expensive, and used at the end of your opponent's charge phase. You target a Deathwing infantry or a walker unit within 6 inches of an enemy unit that is eligible to charge them. That essentially just means that you can't be engaged yourself. Because you're already within 6 inches of an enemy, they are by definition eligible to be charged. So as long as you don't have anything preventing you from charging specifically, you're good to go. You then declare a charge against that enemy unit and resolve that charge. However, you do not receive the charge bonus. That simply means that you don't get fight first. You get all of the other effects of charging. So if you're a Brutalis Dreadnought, for example, you'll impact mortals. You simply don't get that fight first ability. Now, a big question I saw when this dropped was, how is this different than Heroic Intervention? The big thing is that it doesn't require your opponent to have done anything to be eligible as a target. They just have to be within 6 inches of you at the end of their charge phase. So you could use this as a really expensive duplication of Heroic Intervention. You could burn 3 CP in a turn and heroically intervene with 2 units, which would be sick. However, if all your opponent does is just run up to you and stand there, you can just kill them. And that's a big deal. One big way that players deal with Deathwing Knights on the table and big Deathwing Terminator squads is simply jam them. You run a 10 model idiot stupid unit directly in front of them, 1 inch away so that they can't fit their bases through. Watch them do nothing for a turn and then set up your guns to kill them the next turn. In Lion's Blade Task Force, if you're floating 2 CP, which you probably will because you have Azrael, you just burn that 2 CP and kill that enemy unit, get a bunch of additional movement out of it, and then continue on your merry way. In addition, you can also use this on slow units, for example. Let's say you engage an enemy unit and they fall back, but they're like slow and move 5 or have to go around terrain and can't get outside 6 inches of you. You can burn 2 CP in their charge phase to just charge back into melee and hit them again. There's a ton of really interesting uses for this, and while I don't think it's actually going to see that much use in most situations, I think that the biggest deal is that your opponent has to constantly be playing around it. They have to keep their utility units 6 inches away from them. They may not be incentivized to contest your objectives because you'll simply use their contesting infantry units as springboards to charge your Deathwing units further down the table. This is going to be a huge threat to most enemies over the entire course of the game and just waste their brain power trying to work out how to defeat it. And in some situations in the late game, if they don't have enough guns and they can't shoot you to death, you can simply dominate objectives by posting up your units in the middle and threatening your opponent to come try to contest them. Now, these stratagems and kind of this detachment as a whole felt kind of incomprehensible to me when I first looked at them. The more I kind of broke it down in my head, though, the more flexibility I found in Lion's Blade Task Force. Well, I don't think it has quite the same level of raw power and obvious utility as something like Gladius Task Force, and as such, it's probably not going to see as much play as something like that or Ironstorm Spearhead. It does have these very key, unique effects. Things like the ability to redeploy your Terminators, to get wound bonuses in your Deathwing units, charge bonuses, as well as that weird reactive charge at the end of your opponent's charge phase, makes it a wholly unique detachment that's going to be very difficult for your opponent to play around, which is exactly what Dark Angels want to be doing on the table. So let's get in and talk about some list construction using the Lion's Blade Task Force. So here we are, a new recruit doing some list building. Now the list I've built looks pretty standard in terms of a Dark Angels army, and I do think that there are some much more interesting things you can do in this detachment. You can kind of push the specific strengths of the detachment a little bit harder, but what I've done today is basically stick to what is known to be good in Dark Angels, but also throw a little bit of additional flair in there to benefit from things like that illuminating fire. We start with Azrael as the Warlord. He's great. You're basically always going to be playing Azrael if you're in a Dark Angels list. He also has the Deathwing keyword himself, so whatever unit he's joining gets all the Deathwing bonuses that you're talking about. And when we're discussing these Deathwing benefits, one important thing to keep in mind, and one way that you can compose the list, is that most of the epic heroes, at least Asmodai and Ezekiel, as well as Azrael, have that Deathwing keyword. So they can confer the detachment ability of +2 to charge and the ability to benefit from illuminating fire, the reactive charge, all that stuff to the unit they're joining. So there are going to be some builds you can do where you take Azrael and things like Hellblasters, for example. He can confer all of those benefits to a Hellblaster unit. You can use them to shoot. We're not doing that quite today. We're just going to be playing him in Inner Circle Companions because that is tried and true, but there are some way more interesting things that you can use this on. We've also taken Samael here. One of the downsides of this detachment is that you're giving up on-demand advance and charge from something like Gladius Task Force or even the more recent Stormlance builds of Dark Angels that we've been seeing do well. So trying to activate that +2 to charge to get things like your Deathwing Knights into melee is going to be a big part of the stratagem of playing this detachment. So Samael's in here simply because he has the ability to advance, shoot, and charge with his unit. So he basically by himself, as long as he's attached to a unit, we do have an attachment for him in the list, he can by himself essentially turn on all your synergies. He can move through use Knights of Iron to move through terrain features, advance up into the center of the table, shoot his random guns someplace, and turn on illuminating fire, and then charge into something and turn on your +2 to charge. He also himself hits pretty hard, so you're definitely getting some work out of him by himself. So you're not upset to have Samael on the list, but the big thing here is that he gives you a super fast Ravenwing unit that you can use to deliver those buffs. We also have an Intercessor squad. They're just here for utility and to hold down the backline objective. To be perfectly honest, I had some extra points left over after I built the list out and ended up sort of side grading a unit into an Intercessor squad, giving yourself some screens and the ability to lock in your back objective, plus a battle line unit to turn on battle line synergies that Pariah Nexus has. Is going to be pretty solid. We have 2 units of Deathwing Knights. These guys are unattached. I tried to find a place to fit the uppy downy for Deathwing Knights in here, but the points didn't work out. It's so expensive to fit Terminator characters into a list. Can somebody tell me why a Terminator captain costs 100 points? I'll never understand it. Terminator chaplains, I think, are probably way more efficient. The downside is you're pushing almost 400 points for a unit once you get the character and the enhancement in there. That gets a little bit tough to swallow. So we're not playing that today, but we do have another way to deliver the Deathwing Knights, which I'll talk about in a sec. We have Inner Circle Companions. They're already Deathwing units, and obviously Azrael's going to join into that unit as well. So they get 2 times Deathwing, but that means that they can get -1 to be wounded in melee. They're also -1 to be hit while they're being led, so you get both sides of the defensive coin thanks to Strength and Unity, and on top of that, they also get the 4+ invulnerable save from Azrael. It's all good. This unit's great. I don't think I'm really shocking anybody by saying Inner Circle Companions with Azrael are good. We also then have 2 Invader ATVs. These are they're both utility units, and especially with Knights of Iron, the ability to move them through walls, so you can play them kind of like a cheaper suppressor squad almost, where they can add a little bit of damage in. We should probably be playing multi-meltas on these guys, I guess, actually. I'm coming to think of it. That's like Gatling Cannon's kind of just okay. But that allows you to, in a pinch, run them through walls so they can play kind of defensively and then go up and act as screens or perform actions, all that stuff. And then on top of that, they can also act as your sort of backup Ravenwing trigger, so they can move in and to get your charge bonus or shoot stuff to turn on your illuminating fire. It's all good, and for just 60 points for an 8 wound, high toughness, fast unit, I think Invader ATVs are good in basically every situation, and the fact that they're Ravenwing as well, because they're mounted, is just additional benefit. We have a Ravenwing Black Knight squad in here. I originally had these guys as Outriders, but the Black Knights do a little bit more damage than Outriders do, so it's probably a side grade. Outriders are much faster because they can turbo boost, and with Samael attached in, that's the intention. They can go 18 inches, then shoot and charge, so they're super duper fast to turn on, again, those Ravenwing synergies that we're talking about. The Black Knights hit a little bit harder, but you could take them or leave them. You could switch them to Outriders if you feel like you need the extra movement. The big thing here is that these guys have a baked-in vulnerable save, so they're a little tougher to kill, and then they confer anti-monster, anti-vehicle 4 to the unit when they charge, and that's going to affect Samael as well. Last, and certainly not least, we have the bevy of vehicles in the list. We have a Stormspeeder Hammer Strike. This, I think, is probably the #1, the peak applicator of illuminating fire, because it will also strip cover from something it shoots at as well. So you can run this guy in, or just deep strike it, to be honest, who cares? Shoot something with its grenade launchers, or one of its grenade launchers, doesn't matter what it shoots it at. Apply the illuminating fire, and if you hit them, strip cover from them, then fire all your melted destroyers and your big punchy weapons somewhere else. In a pinch, too, any of these Ravenwing units can get up close and personal to enemies enemies, provide them that desperate breakout penalty, and also turn on your +2 to charge bonus. So the Storm Speeder is like running up and just being aggressive is also just fine. But the big thing there is that you're going to be getting potentially +1 to wound and ignore cover for your Ballistus Dreadnoughts. As I mentioned before, Ballistus Dreadnoughts get the Deathwing keyword, so they're benefiting from all those synergies. Plus, they're only AP 2 or 3, so getting that additional ignore cover from the Hammer Strike is huge. I think this is a match made in heaven. And the Ballistus Dreadnoughts, like 70% of the time, get hit rerolls, so you don't even need Oath of Moment for them to shoot something. But the Ballistus Dreadnoughts, with their powers combined with the Hammer Strike, should be good enough to kill basically like one of almost anything, unless its defensive characteristics are super huge, thanks to the combination of that +1 to wound and ignore cover. We also get a Land Raider Redeemer in here. I guess we'll add all the extra weapons on that little guy too, just for posterity's sake. The Redeemer's already good as just a big tank sort of anchor for the list. It can deliver one of the Deathwing Knight units, and you can potentially like teleport Homer the other one in if you want to, for example. But the other thing is that the Redeemer's Flamestorm cannons are excellent with +1 to wound. Again, it's a Deathwing unit, so we can benefit from illuminating fire with this thing. And once it starts wounding vehicles on 4-ish and getting the +1 to wound on the multi-melta as well, that's when it starts doing just ridiculous damage. Light to medium vehicles just start melting in front of this thing. You could even potentially be -1 to wound in melee if you get hit with something high enough strength, which is hugely beneficial. Plus, it's going to be able to move up, jump that assault ramp, dump out the Deathwing Knights 3 inches away, and then benefit from their +2 to charge from the Ravenwing unit engaging. So I think it's the easiest way to deliver a Deathwing Knight unit without having to rapid ingress them in, for example. So that's the list I constructed. The one thing I am a little bit worried about is that this particular version is a little light on forward operators. There's no scouts, there's no infiltrators, for example. It's a little tough to fit them in once you're trying to do the characters and the character attachments. You could maybe cut the Intercessor squad for some forward operation stuff. So there is a little flexibility that you can garner there, but otherwise you have to start dropping either the big punchy units or combo pieces in order to fit more utility in. But again, there's a lot of evolution that can be done. So let me know down in the comment section what you think about this list and what you think about the Lion's Blade Detachment. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, either over on Patreon, patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All those people, you're amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.